In a quiet American town where evenings arrived softly and streets emptied early, there stood an old house where music lived inside the walls. It was not a famous academy or a modern school, but a place where melodies carried memories and silence often spoke louder than sound. The house belonged to Richard Carter, a man in his late 40s whose life had slowly narrowed down to music alone. Teaching was not just his profession, it was the only way he kept himself from feeling completely empty. One autumn morning, as dry leaves covered the porch, a gentle knock echoed through the house. When Richard opened the door, he saw a young woman standing there, her posture calm but her eyes restless, as if they were holding back something heavy. She introduced herself as Lara and said she wanted to learn music. There was no excitement in her voice, only quiet determination. Richard looked at her for a moment and told her that music demanded patience and honesty, not just talent. Lara nodded and replied that she was ready for both. From the first lesson, Richard realized Lara was different from other students. She arrived on time every day, spoke very little, and listened deeply. When she sat at the piano, her fingers trembled, not because she lacked skill, but because every note seemed to touch something buried inside her. She didn't play to impress. She played to release something she could not name. Sometimes she would stop in the middle of a melody and stare at the keys as if they had reminded her of something painful. When Richard once asked why she stopped, she answered softly that some sounds hurt more than silence. He didn't question her further, because he understood that feeling too well. As weeks turned into months, Lara's music grew stronger, but so did the unspoken bond between them. They spent hours in the same room, surrounded by sound and quiet at the same time. Richard kept reminding himself that she was only a student, yet every day it became harder to ignore how her presence softened the loneliness he had carried for years. There was a stillness between them that felt safe and dangerous at the same time, a connection that grew without permission. One evening, rain poured heavily outside as Lara played the piano, but her melody kept breaking apart. Her hands slowed, then stopped completely, and tears fell onto the keys. Richard called her name in concern, and she stood up, her voice shaking as she said she hadn't come there just to learn music. She said music was the only place where her pain didn't need explanations. Her words filled the room with a silence that felt heavier than any sound. Richard felt something shift inside him, something he had buried long ago, and for the first time in years he didn't know how to protect himself from it. After that night, everything changed without either of them saying it out loud. Their conversations became shorter, but their awareness of each other grew deeper. Every lesson felt loaded with emotions they refused to acknowledge. Richard knew what was happening, and the knowledge frightened him. This was no longer just a teacher and a student sharing music. One night after class, Lara asked him if he had ever felt that some people enter your life not to stay, but to leave a wound. Without thinking, Richard replied that sometimes people mistake that wound for love. Lara looked at him, and in her eyes were fear, hope, and the beginning of goodbye. The next day Lara did not come. Then another day passed, and then a week. Richard realized her absence hurt more than her presence ever had. When she finally returned, her face looked calm but resolved. She told him she needed to stop coming to the lessons. When he asked why, she took a deep breath and said that if she didn't stop, she might fall in love with someone she could never have. She left before he could respond, and the house returned to its familiar silence. The piano was still there, the instruments untouched, but the music felt gone. Richard stood alone, knowing this story was far from over, and that the real pain had only just begun. Richard stood alone in the quiet house long after Lara had left. The door had closed gently, but the sound echoed inside him like something final. He didn't move for a long time. The piano sat in front of him untouched, its keys still carrying the warmth of her fingers. For the first time in his life, music felt distant, like something he had once loved but could no longer reach. Days passed without Lara, then weeks. Richard continued teaching other students, but every melody felt hollow. He corrected notes, explained theory, smiled politely, yet inside him there was a constant silence. He found himself waiting for footsteps that never came, listening for a knock that stayed imaginary. At night, when the house was empty, he sometimes sat at the piano and played the pieces Lara used to struggle with, stopping at the same broken notes where she had once stopped, as if the music itself remembered her. Lara, meanwhile, tried to build a life without that house. She told herself she had made the right decision. She focused on work, filled her days with routine, and avoided music altogether. But at night, when the world slowed down, melodies returned uninvited. She heard Richard's voice correcting her posture, felt his quiet presence behind her, and remembered how safe she had felt sitting in that room. She hated herself for missing it. She hated herself more for missing him. Months later, Richard received a small envelope in the mail. There was no return address. Inside was a single piece of paper with a few lines written in Lara's handwriting. She wrote that she was doing fine, that she hoped he was well, and that she had stopped playing music because it reminded her too much of things she couldn't have. She thanked him for teaching her more than just notes, and apologized for leaving the way she did. Richard read the letter over and over until the words blurred. He never replied. He didn't know how to put absence into sentences. Time continued its quiet cruelty. Lara's family began to pressure her into settling down. They spoke of stability, of suitable matches, of a future that made sense on paper. Lara listened without arguing. She felt tired, and tired people often stop fighting. When she eventually agreed to meet someone, she told herself it was not betrayal, just survival. Love, she believed, was not meant for people like her. Richard heard about Lara's engagement from a mutual acquaintance. The news arrived casually, without ceremony, and yet it shattered something fragile inside him. He congratulated the person politely and returned home with steady steps, only to collapse into the chair once the door was shut. That night, he played the piano until his fingers ached, pouring everything he had never said into the keys. It was the most honest music he had ever made, and no one was there to hear it. A few weeks before Lara's wedding, she found herself standing outside Richard's house without knowing how she had gotten there. Her hands trembled as she rang the bell. When Richard opened the door, time seemed to hesitate. They stood facing each other, older somehow, heavier, both aware that this moment was dangerous. Lara apologized for coming unannounced, said she just needed to return a music book she had borrowed long ago. Richard took the book silently and invited her inside. They sat in the same room where everything had once begun. Neither of them mentioned the wedding, but it hung in the air between them. Lara looked around, noticing how little had changed and how much she had. She told him she was getting married because it was easier than explaining why she was still alone. Richard listened without interruption, his face calm but his heart loud. Before leaving, Lara asked him to play something just once more. Richard hesitated, then sat at the piano. He played slowly, gently, letting the music speak where words could not. Lara closed her eyes, tears sliding down her face, knowing this was goodbye in its truest form. When the last note faded, she thanked him, whispered that she would always remember him, and walked out without looking back. Richard did not follow. Some goodbyes demand stillness. Lara's marriage was quiet, practical, and empty in ways no one could see. She smiled at gatherings, fulfilled expectations, and lived the life others approved of. But music never returned to her. She avoided it like an old wound, because every note reminded her of the person she had been when she was brave enough to feel deeply. Richard grew older in the same house, teaching fewer students each year. His reputation remained strong, but his heart stayed closed. Sometimes, late at night, he imagined a different life, one where courage had arrived sooner, where rules had mattered less than truth. Those thoughts always ended the same way, with acceptance that some loves exist only to teach you what you can never keep. Years later, on a quiet evening much like the one when Lara had first arrived, Richard sat alone at the piano. His hands moved slowly, tired but familiar with the keys. He played the melody she had once struggled with, this time without stopping. The music flowed gently, carrying sorrow, gratitude, and resignation. When he finished, he rested his hands and closed his eyes, feeling the weight of a life shaped by silence. Somewhere else, Lara paused while passing a music store window. A piano inside caught her eye. For a brief moment, her chest tightened, and she felt the echo of a love that had never been allowed to live fully. Then she walked on, carrying the quiet pain of a story that had ended not with anger or betrayal, but with distance. They never met again. Their love did not fail because it was weak, but because it arrived at the wrong time, in the wrong roles, and demanded courage neither of them could give. And so it remained unfinished, living only in memory, in music never played, and in the silence that followed them both for the rest of their lives.